Remember when a horror film was made in a building where a Beatle would later be murdered, scored by a composer who would die 8 months after recording the final note, produced by a man so convinced the devil was after him that he went into years of seclusion, while the director's pregnant wife, who had been considered for the lead role, was being stalked by a cult that would kill her the following summer? None of these facts are in the film. All of them are real, and the film managed to be terrifying entirely on its own before any of this had happened. Directed and written by Roman Polanski, produced by William Castle, and starring Mia Farrow and John Cassavetes, with Ruth Gordon, Sidney Blackmer, Ralph Bellamy, and a very early Charles Grodin rounding out the cast, Rosemary's Baby took Ira Levin's 1967 novel and adapted it, with a faithfulness that Levin himself would later describe as the single most faithful adaptation of a novel ever produced by Hollywood. It made 10 times its budget, it terrified a generation, and it left a trail of genuinely strange events in its wake that nobody planned and nobody can adequately explain. Today we're counting down 15 weird facts about Rosemary's Baby, and stick around for number 1 because the producer who secured the rights to this film and made it all possible was so destroyed by what followed that he spent years convinced Satan was personally responsible. Hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment. Is Rosemary's Baby the most genuinely disturbing film ever made, or does something else take that title for you? Make the case below. Alright, the neighbors are very friendly. Let's get into it. Before Mia Farrow was in the conversation, Roman Polanski had a different actress in mind for the central role. His own wife, Sharon Tate, who had appeared in his previous film The Fearless Vampire Killers and whom he had recently married, was one of the names Polanski considered for Rosemary Woodhouse. Producer Robert Evans fought against it. Evans was determined to have Mia Farrow, and he had the contractual authority to back that determination. Polanski wanted Tuesday Weld as an alternative to Farrow and considered Tate as another possibility. Evans got his way. Farrow was cast. Tate appeared briefly, uncredited, as a background figure at a party scene. She is in the film for a few seconds. A year after its release, she was killed at her rented home on Cielo Drive by members of the Manson family. She was 8.5 months pregnant. The character she hadn't been cast to play was a pregnant woman being targeted by a satanic cult. The overlap between the film's fiction and what happened to the woman who wasn't cast in it is something nobody who has spent time with both facts manages to leave behind easily. William Castle was the man who made Rosemary's Baby possible, and he did it through a combination of industry instinct and genuine speed. Ira Levin's novel was still in galleys, not yet published, not yet reviewed, not yet a bestseller, when Castle read it and immediately understood what it was. He secured the rights before the book had a commercial track record of any kind, before the industry knew what to make of it, before Robert Evans or Paramount had any reason to be interested. Castle paid for something that, at the point of purchase, was just a manuscript with no reputation attached. He then brought it to Paramount, where Evans agreed to back it on one condition: Castle would produce but not direct. Castle had built his entire career on directing low-budget horror films with gimmicks, wired seats that buzzed during the tingler, insurance policies sold to audience members who might die of fright, nurses stationed in lobbies. He was extraordinary at manufacturing sensation. Evans understood that manufacturing sensation was not the same skill as what Rosemary's Baby required. He insisted on Polanski. Castle, who had the rights and wanted the production to exist more than he wanted to direct it himself, agreed. It was, by any honest retrospective assessment, the most important creative decision of his career, handing over the film he'd found to the director who could actually make it. When Roman Polanski sat down to adapt Ira Levin's novel for the screen, he made a structural decision that distinguished his approach from nearly every other literary adaptation in Hollywood history. He did not attempt to condense, restructure, or impose a different shape on the material. He followed the novel almost scene by scene, beat by beat, line by line, lifting dialogue directly from Levin's pages wherever possible and inventing almost nothing. Levis himself later described the finished film as the most faithful adaptation of any of his novels, more faithful, in fact, than he had expected any commercial adaptation could be. The consequence of this fidelity is a film that moves at a pace almost no Hollywood horror film before or since has matched: slow, accumulative, patient, in a way that studio executives typically describe as commercial suicide. Polanski understood that the novel's horror lived in its domesticity. The terror of Rosemary's Baby is not the satanic cult. It's the normalcy surrounding it. The cult functions within an entirely ordinary apartment building among apparently ordinary neighbors, and the horror accumulates in the gap between what Rosemary perceives and what the audience is beginning to suspect. You can only sustain that gap if you let the normal stuff breathe. Polanski let it breathe. The film runs at 2 hours and 17 minutes, and very little of it is waste. Frank Sinatra and Mia Farrow were married during the production of Rosemary's Baby. Sinatra was at the time filming The Detective, a film he expected Farrow to leave Rosemary's Baby to join him in, a film in which she had been offered a role. Farrow refused to leave. She was committed to Polanski's production, committed to the role, and unwilling to abandon either for a Frank Sinatra vehicle that she understood to be considerably less interesting than what she was already making. Sinatra disagreed with this assessment of priorities. Farrow later described the specific moment when Sinatra's lawyer arrived on the set of Rosemary's Baby carrying a brown envelope. She was presented with divorce papers. This was, by her own account, the first mention of divorce in their marriage, not a conversation, not an ultimatum, not a discussion, but a lawyer and an envelope on a working film set during production. Farrow signed the papers without reading them. She stayed on the production. She finished the film. Rosemary's Baby made 10 times its budget. The Detective was a moderate success that nobody talks about anymore. The marriage was over before the film was released. Polanski's approach to the scene in which a distracted Rosemary wanders absently into moving New York traffic was direct and unambiguous. He wanted the real thing. Real traffic, real horns, real tires. The production's crew declined to participate. No crew member was willing to walk into active Manhattan traffic for a film shoot, even with a camera in their hand. Polanski operated the handheld camera himself, walking behind Farrow as she stepped off the pavement and into the stream of moving vehicles on a live New York City street, telling her that nobody was going to run over a visibly pregnant woman. He walked behind her on the opposite side, specifically positioning himself so that if a driver failed to stop in time, Farrow would be the one hit rather than him. The honking horns and screeching brakes captured in the finished film are genuine responses from real New York drivers who had no idea they were on a film set and who were reacting to a genuinely unexpected pedestrian situation. Farrow later described a strange, euphoric feeling coming over her as she walked into the traffic, a combination of adrenaline and the specific quality of working with a director who treated the absence of safety protocols as a creative resource rather than a liability. The opening credits of Rosemary's Baby play over Mia Farrow's voice, singing the film's central lullaby, wordless, suspended, walking a line between comforting and deeply wrong. The effect is one of the most precise pieces of tonal engineering in the history of horror film music, and it was achieved partly by accident. Composer Krzysztof Komeda, working with Polanski on the score, needed a vocalist for the lullaby. Polanski decided that Farrow should sing it herself. Farrow was not a professional singer. She had not recorded vocals professionally before this. She did it anyway, and Polanski later expressed genuine, specific surprise at how effectively she could carry the melody, calling what she produced a dimension of the film that he hadn't entirely anticipated. The result is that the most recognizable piece of audio in Rosemary's Baby, the thing that signals, airily, that something is wrong from the first frame, belongs to the woman playing the protagonist, delivered not by a trained vocalist, but by an actress who happened to be able to hum the right notes in the right way at the right moment. Komeda's composition earned a Golden Globe nomination. Farrow's voice is what makes it work. Her name appears nowhere on the songwriting credits. Krzysztof Komeda was a Polish jazz pianist and composer who had worked with Polanski since the early 1960s, providing scores for Knife in the Water and The Fearless Vampire Killers before Rosemary's Baby. He was 37 years old, and at the peak of his career when he came to Los Angeles in 1968 to record the film's score. The recording session at RCA Studios in Hollywood happened in April. The film was released in June. By December, Komeda was in a coma. He had been pushed off a rocky escarpment during a drinking party in Los Angeles, pushed specifically by a Polish writer named Marek Chłasko, under circumstances that remain disputed and were never formally prosecuted. He never regained consciousness. He was flown back to Warsaw, where he died in April 1969, 8 months after completing his work on the film. In Ira Levin's novel, one of the witches' coven causes a death by engineering a fall from a height that results in a brain hemorrhage and a lingering decline. The method by which the composer of Rosemary's Baby died, 8 months after completing its score, is the method the witches in the source material used to kill someone. This is the kind of fact that sits in your stomach long after you've told it to someone. If you've just started keeping a mental tally of how many people connected to this film came to a strange end, hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment. Coincidence, or does something about this film genuinely seem to attract the wrong kind of attention? Make your case below. Now back to the Dakota. William Castle was not a passive presence on the Rosemary's Baby production. He clashed with Polanski over creative decisions throughout, received an enormous volume of hate mail from religious groups and moral campaigners following the film's release, and became, in the months after the premiere, genuinely convinced that something connected to the film's content was operating against him personally. In April 1969, he was hospitalized with severe kidney stones. In a delirious state, by multiple accounts, he shouted that Rosemary should drop the knife. confusing the film's protagonist with his own circumstances in a way that suggests the production had become badly tangled with his sense of reality. Castle remained in a state of significant personal distress for years after the film's release. He described his period of hospitalization and recovery as one marked by what he experienced as supernatural interference, and by his own account went into a prolonged period of near seclusion afterward. The man who had built a career on manufacturing the sensation of horror for paying audiences found himself, in the aftermath of the one genuinely important film he had produced, unable to fully distinguish the product from his own life. He had spent decades giving people the feeling that something was after them. He spent several years afterward fairly certain something was after him. The exterior of the Bramford, the dark Gothic apartment building where Rosemary and Guy Woodhouse take up residence, where the coven operates, where the film's entire sense of enclosed dread is established, is the Dakota on West 72nd Street at Central Park West in Manhattan. Built in 1884, Gothic in design, the kind of building that looks like it was designed specifically to appear in a horror film, the Dakota had among its notable residents Boris Karloff, Lauren Bacall, Judy Garland, and Leonard Bernstein, a resident list that is, by any measure, not ominous. Then there is John Lennon, who lived in the building from 1973 and was shot dead outside its entrance in December 1980 by a man who had been waiting for him. Lennon had no connection to Rosemary's Baby. He was a tenant of the building 12 years after filming Wrapped. But the coincidences that accumulate around this film have a way of reaching out laterally. Lennon had written a song for Mia Farrow's sister Prudence, who had retreated to her room during a meditation retreat with the Beatles in India in 1968, the same year Rosemary's Baby was filmed. The Manson family, who killed Sharon Tate and whose murderous ideology was partly constructed around Beatles lyrics, wrote those lyrics in blood at the scene of Tate's murder. The Dakota, where Lennon lived and died, is the physical location where Rosemary's Baby was filmed. These connections don't form a line. They form a very strange, very dark kind of web. Ruth Gordon played Minnie Castevet, the relentlessly cheerful, aggressively friendly, distinctly sinister neighbor who drives much of the film's action through a performance of absolute normality that becomes increasingly horrifying the longer you watch it. She won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress for the role. She was 72 years old at the ceremony. She had been working as an actress since the 1910s. She had been nominated for Academy Awards before. For Inside Daisy Clover and as a screenplay writer, she had never won. Rosemary's Baby was the film that gave Ruth Gordon her Oscar. A performance built on cheerfulness, intrusiveness, and the specific horror of a person who simply will not leave you alone, delivered by a woman who had spent over 50 years in the industry before anyone gave her the award, remains one of the most beloved supporting performances in horror film history. Gordon later described the character in interviews with the kind of affection that suggested she found Minnie considerably less sinister than everyone else did. Perhaps that's why it worked. John Cassavetes, who played Guy Woodhouse, the husband who knowingly allows his wife to be used by the coven in exchange for career success, was not an easy presence on set. Cassavetes was himself a director with a specific and strongly held set of ideas about how films should be made, loosely, intuitively, with improvisation valued over scripted precision, and actors given room to find the scene rather than execute a predetermined version of it. Polanski's approach was the exact opposite. He was meticulous, controlling, and faithful to the written text in a way that Cassavetes found both professionally frustrating and personally antagonizing. By multiple accounts, including Polanski's own, Cassavetes was ready to have it out with him on several occasions throughout the shoot. The tension was real, documented, and sustained across the entire production. What makes this tension specifically interesting is the character Cassavetes was playing. Guy Woodhouse is a man who sells his wife's body and agency to people who want to use her in exchange for professional advancement. He does it because he has calculated that his career matters more than her well-being, her consent, or her knowledge of what's being done to her. Cassavetes was playing a man who subordinates someone else's creative autonomy to his own professional ambitions, while himself attempting to subordinate Polanski's directorial authority to his own preferences. The character and the actor were running the same argument on parallel tracks, one in the script and one on set, throughout the entire shoot. Whether or not Cassavetes ever noticed the symmetry, it is impossible not to notice from the outside. Polanski scattered coded details throughout Rosemary's Baby in the visual text of the film itself, subliminal arrangements that wouldn't register consciously for most viewers but were nonetheless present. One of the most discussed is in the sequence where Rosemary, in a panic, dials a number from a phone booth. The specific digits she mouths while working the rotary dial, when that sequence of digits is written out and the paper turned upside down, spell a word connected to the film's subject matter. Polanski confirmed the deliberateness of this choice. It was not an accident of prop design, it was placed there specifically. The film is full of this kind of precision. The baby's due date, worked out from the in-story timeline, resolves to June 6, 1966, 6666. Every element of the film's surface normalcy has something placed just below it. Polanski's achievement in Rosemary's Baby is that the film works whether you notice these details or not, whether you're watching for them or simply watching. The hidden layer exists for the people who look, the horror exists for everyone. In the sequence where Rosemary's unusual dietary cravings become a visual signal of what's happening to her body, Mia Farrow is shown eating raw liver, handling it, consuming it, performing the scene with the kind of specificity that Polanski required from everything on screen. Farrow was at the time a committed vegetarian. She ate the liver anyway, not a prop, not a substitute, not something that was cut around in editing. She ate raw meat in a scene for a director who required it because the alternative was not doing the scene the way it needed to be done. This detail sits alongside the traffic walk and the divorce papers, as part of a consistent portrait of a production in which the professional stakes were high enough and the creative commitment deep enough that a significant amount of what would normally be considered unreasonable was simply accepted as the cost of making the film correctly. Farrow is in every scene of Rosemary's Baby except one. The dream sequence where Rosemary's body is used by the coven, for which a body double was used. Every other moment in the film belongs to her. She walked into traffic for it. She signed divorce papers on its set. She ate raw liver for it. The film got what it needed from her every time. William Castle, the man who found the novel, secured the rights, brought it to Paramount, and agreed to step aside as director so that Polanski could make it, appears in Rosemary's Baby as an uncredited background figure. He plays a man smoking a cigar outside the phone booth where Rosemary makes her desperate call to her doctor, present in the background, watching, doing nothing useful, powerless to intervene. The man who was supposed to direct the film stands in the background of one of its most pivotal scenes, watching events unfold that he cannot control. Whether Castle found this casting funny, appropriate, painful, or some combination of all three is not on record. What is on record is that he had enough self-awareness to accept the cameo, to stand in the film he hadn't been allowed to direct, playing a bystander, while Mia Farrow performed the scene he would have directed differently. The man in the background with the cigar, watching helplessly, is the producer of the film. It is the most precise piece of accidental symbolism in the movie. This is the fact that closes the entire loop. William Castle found the book. Castle got the film made. Castle agreed to step aside so Polanski could direct it. Castle produced the most successful horror film Paramount had released to that point, a film that made 10 times its budget, that earned Oscar nominations, that made Ruth Gordon a household name, and Mia Farrow a film actress rather than a television personality. Castle did all of this, and then watched what followed. The hate mail began arriving in quantities that were by any account overwhelming. Letter after letter from people who considered the film satanic, who held Castle personally responsible for its existence and its content, who wanted him to understand what they believed he had done. The Sharon Tate murders happened 14 months after the film's release. Castle was hospitalized with kidney stones and hallucinated the film's dialogue in his hospital bed. He went into seclusion. He became, by multiple accounts of the period, a man who had started to believe that the subject matter of the film he had produced had attached itself to his life in a way he couldn't fully explain or dismiss. Castle didn't stop making films. He worked until his death in 1977, but the years immediately following Rosemary's Baby were not the victory lap of a producer whose instincts had been spectacularly vindicated. They were something considerably stranger. A man who had made the right call professionally, who had found the right property and put the right director on it, who had produced one of the most important American films of the 1960s, and who ended up in a hospital room shouting at a fictional pregnant woman to put down a knife that she was never holding in the first place. The devil, Castle believed, got what he'd paid for. Castle wasn't sure what that made him, so there you have it. 15 weird facts about a film whose director wanted to cast the woman who would be murdered a year later in the lead role, whose composer died by the same method the witches in the source material use, whose producer ended up hospitalized and hallucinating the script, whose lead actress signed divorce papers on set and ate raw meat for a director while her husband threatened to brawl with him, and which was filmed in a building where a beetle would later be shot dead. The author called it the most faithful adaptation of any of his novels. The production cost $3 million and made 33. And all of it started with a producer who read a manuscript nobody had published yet and understood immediately what it was. Like, subscribe, and share this with whoever first made you watch Rosemary's Baby in the dark and didn't warn you about the ending. They knew what they were doing. Until next time, trust your instincts. Rosemary didn't, and and look how that turned out.